I see your slides. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just test this. I press it, it doesn't move. Oh, I got press. Okay, I think
You're there.
I think I'm here.
Yes.
Okay.
And we're recording.
Okay, it's in the wrong place.
Can everybody see Don's slides?
Just use the clicker here instead of that. It's
Okay, I'm
easier.
gonna use this is easier.
Okay.
Somehow the battle of bunker.
Hi, Jerry. Yes, Jerry.
Bear with
Jerry,
me.
and I will be.
Give me one
Jerry,
more minute.
Go ahead,
Go back up to number 1, honey.
I know. but-
Jerry. I will be joining from different view from my phone to the computer, so you'll see me joining once again.
Okay.
All right.
Oh,
So
over and out.
I think I'm ready. I see they have a slide out of place, but I can work through that easily enough. So, are we all set?
Yeah.
Okay. So, excuse me. So, as an overview of the American Revolution, 1753 to 1783. The American Revolution was actually fought between 1775 and 1781. Before the revolution actually started, I want to give you a little history, a little bit of a background to it, which will help us when we get to that point to understand the revolution a little bit better. So, and there are many ways to look at this. You can look at it politically, socially, economically. The purpose of this, what we're going to talk about basically is to give you the information in chronological order with some side comments to give you some information on what really happened during these 30 years. And as we'll soon find out, the same person who started this in 1753 is the same person who ended it in 1783, and that was George Washington. So we'll get to that, which is a little ironic, I thought. But to backtrack just a little bit, before 1753, there were European claims to North America. Great Britain's claim was from John Cabot, who cited Nova Scotia and Virginia in the early 1500s, Jamestown in 1607, and Plymouth in 1620 by the Pilgrims. Those were the claims of Great Britain to country in North America. And France's claims were based upon the exploration of Canada. And I'm going to get to the next. Okay, so we can take a look at this for a minute. So the white, as you see, are the British claims. France's claims were based on the exploration of Canada from Great Lakes all the way down to Louisiana and through the Mississippi River by 3 explorers, Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain, and Robert La Salle in the same time frame in the early 1500s to the early 1600s. And Florida was discovered by Ponce de Leon in 1513. And then the Dutch, of course, founded New York City and in 1624, and then which they call New Amsterdam, sold it to England in 1664, who renamed it New York. So that's the background of what you see here on the map. So permanent French occupation began in Quebec in the early 1600s and Louisiana in the early 1700s. So the goal of France was to connect Quebec and that area down through the Allegheny Ohio River to their territory, Louisiana. That was the goal here. And the British goal, and I think I can get, if you can see my cursor, was to extend, these are the Appalachian Mountains, was to extend westward through Pennsylvania, basically Pennsylvania and Virginia. So as the English expanded westward and the French expanded southward, there obviously is going to be a conflict here. And the conflict is going to come right here. That's why this red line is Fort Duquesne, or what is now Pittsburgh. That's where the rub will be, with the French heading south and the English heading west. So by the 1750s, what they call the Ohio River Valley comes into conflict, and with the French moving south and the British moving west. So in 1753, France began to erect a series of forts from Lake Erie in here, down towards the forks of the Ohio, which is now Pittsburgh. And so the Virginia governor, who was Robert Dinwiddie, hears of all of this, and he chooses George Washington to deliver a message to the French in what is now Western Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh area, to challenge the claims of the Allegheny River Valley. And he tells Washington to demand an immediate withdrawal if the French don't leave. And, quote, to drive them off by force. So Washington, in the meantime, now he is 21 years old. He has already been trained as a surveyor. He was trained as a surveyor at age 18. He's already surveyed a lot of the Shenandoah Valley, which is now in Maryland. Hang on a minute. In Maryland and West Virginia area, right around here. So he's been out there. He surveyed that area for the Fairfaxes, which was a wealthy family in Virginia, and had purchased 2,000 acres there in 1752 when he was 20, year before. So in 1753, the same year that Dinwiddie chooses Washington, Washington got the job because his half-brother Lawrence had passed away, and Lawrence had the job. So George got his position as what they call an adjutant general or top administrative post for Virginia. So Dinwiddie hires Washington to go out there. So in October of 1753, he leaves for the frontier and he arrives there in December. So he meets the French commander, and the commander says, no. He said, we're not going to give this up. He said, the country belongs to us. So George leaves and he reports back to Dinwiddie. So that ends that particular situation. So the next slide here, I wanted to show you just to backtrack for a minute. This is Fort Niagara, and which was built in 1726. And so in 53 and 54, as the conflict between the French and the British start to escalate a little bit, they remodeled it and expanded it to what you see here. Basically, this is the fort today as it was back in 1755, of course, right where the Niagara River meets Lake Ontario, which you can see in the background. So Washington comes back to Dinwiddie in the spring of 1754. Dinwiddie sends Washington back a second time. And at this point, he is a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia Regiment. He is not part of the British Army. He's in the Virginia Colonial Regiment. He's the first colonel there, and actually a lieutenant colonel. So he goes back to the same area around Pittsburgh, this time with 160 troops, and he returns. And on his way, excuse me, bear with me for 1 minute, he runs into several French and Indians en route to Pittsburgh. And there's a battle. It's the first skirmish or battle of the situation. And within 15 minutes, no one knows who fired the first shot. But within 15 minutes, 10 French are dead and 21 are captured. And one of the French who are dead is a guy by the name of, his last name is pronounced de Jumonville. And they found out after he was killed that he had a letter in his pocket that he wanted to establish peace with the British, and he was like a diplomat. And they didn't discover this until after he was dead, and they realized they had made a mistake. So the British and the colonials retreat, and this was in May of 1754. So on their way back, they decided that the British or the French were going to come after them. So they built Fort Necessity about 20 miles away from the first skirmish. Okay, this is Fort Necessity, if you want to call it a fort. It's like a stockade, obviously. So there is a battle here on July 3rd, 1754. So about a month and a half after the first one, and the British lose badly. They have 400 captured and 30 wounded. Okay, the French have 3 killed and 20 wounded. And very sad for for the British. Washington has to sign an agreement that they killed Jumonville. They were wrong. The best part of this is that they were allowed to return the British soldiers, British and Virginia military, including Washington, were not captured. They were allowed to leave and return and go back to Virginia with their arms and promise not to come back again. So that's the Battle of Fort Necessity. That was in July of 54. So now we go the following year. So we go to 1755 to July, 13 months later. Now Washington is returning, so he's going back a third time with General Edward Braddock, more forces, more troops, and they want to take Fort Duquesne again. So they're going to try for the third time, and this is a disaster for the British. So the British are in blue on the right, and the French and Indians are on the left. And basically what happens is the British encounter in this area here, encounter the French, and the British have to retreat. Where the blue lines are, one here, there's a second retreat line in the center, and then another line here. They cross the Monongahela River. They're about 8 miles from Fort Duquesne, and they have to retreat. Braddock is killed. Once he is killed, Washington was second in command. So he takes over and he retreats across the Monongahela back to Virginia. So the results here were 100 of the British were killed or wounded, and only 20 of the French killed or wounded. So in their attempts to take the Fort Duquesne, they have failed. Now, I bring these three battles up because these were the tip-off points to start the French and Indian War, which was from 1756 to 1763. It was called the French and Indian War in North America, the 7 Years' War, everyone else in the world at this point. So that's why I mention this. Washington obviously was heavily involved in all three battles. He gets great experience, although it's very negative, but he's really battle scarred, so to speak, and he has a lot of experience in that regard. One final note to all of this. So this was in July of 1755. 3 years later, in November of 1758, Washington goes back a fourth time to get Fort Duquesne with 7,000 troops, British troops. And when they get to Fort Duquesne, the French have evacuated it. At that point, they were starting to lose some of the battles of the French and Indian War. They felt that Fort Duquesne was not worth, the French had abandoned it because it was unsuitable and costly. So they went in, obviously the fort was abandoned. They renamed it Fort Pitt in honor of the British Prime Minister, William Pitt. And of course, that's where the name Pittsburgh comes from. So in 1758, he has spent 5 years in the militia for Virginia from 1753 to 1758. That was his commission. So his commission is over, and he resigns his commission and he retires to Mount Vernon, which has been given to him by his half-brother Lawrence. That's how that property came to be. He's in the process of being married to Martha, and so he leaves his commission in the British Army. But also in the 5-year period, he develops a heart and a feeling against the British. He wanted a commission in the British Army. He never got it. He scraped for it. He's worked hard. He's engaged, but he felt he was annoyed that he never got the recognition he should have deserved. So he's learned a lot of skills, but he never got the British commission like his half-brother Lawrence did. So he's slowly beginning to dislike the British. He goes back to Mount Vernon, and then eventually between then and when he becomes commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in 1755, he serves in the Virginia legislature called the Virginia House of Burgesses. So the French Indian War ends in 1763. And so this is what it looks like. So the dark red is the British property before the treaty. The British gains, which were all the French territory in the first map, is all in pink. The Spanish are down in Florida before, and then the Spanish gained all this property from the French afterwards, in the yellow, so to speak. And you can read from there. Where Florida is, where we are, it was lost by Spain and gained by Britain in 1763. So when Great Britain won at the Treaty of Paris, when they beat the French, they also gained Florida. Then they would lose it when they lost the Revolution. So they get it and they lose it. Then there's Indian Reserve up where the stripes are, up here is right here, I'm sorry, Indian Reserve. You can, very explanatory. And then the area of unexplored. So that's what we're looking like. And this map on the lower left is basically the same, only a little bit simpler. So the British have gained all this territory as a result of the Treaty of Paris of 1763. The same year, the British passed the Proclamation of 1763, which bars colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and private citizens cannot purchase land in that areas. So where this green line is, they can't go west of that. They can't go into the new territory that Britain gained. You can't settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. So what happened here was that George Grenville, the Prime Minister of England, felt that the colonists were subjects. Now this is 12 years before the start of the Revolution, and they were subservient parts of the British Empire. So they had this attitude and this feeling, this is how I see it, is to push the colonists down. That they hear the colonists help the British beat the French, and then they turn right around and push down the colonists. So the colonists viewed themselves as British citizens. So there's a difference here. So what that leaves us is here, and the reason why I talk about all this is that 1763, the war is over, the French are out, but the British, as you all know from, if you studied American history, are very much indebted because of the war. They have a desperate need for revenue. So the war cost them 137 million pounds, whatever that translates to today, but compared to a peacetime budget of only 8 pounds. So you're talking 15 times as much as normally would be. So beginning in 1764, the following year, for 10 years, every year or almost every year, Britain will pass a series of acts to in the colonies to generate revenue to pay for their debts from this war. All right. Now, any questions? Can I hear, Jerry, can I hear you at all or not? You're all on mute?
I do have a question. I just
Yes.
unmuted myself.
Go ahead.
So it sounds like how George Washington broke his promise. What I mean by it is this: he was told to go back, never to raise the arm against French, and there he came back, swinging the swords. Not only that, commanding the battle.
That's right. In the beginning, right? Now that was supposedly a quote when he says to Washington, "Do whatever you have to do," or so to speak, to do that, and he did not do that. Yes.
All right. Just pointing it out.
Yeah. So, and I don't know what the engagement was in the very beginning, whether he was intimidated. Maybe there was a lot of French and Indians and together. I don't know. But what he told him to do, he did not do.
Gotcha. Well, that means he broke his promise twice, because second time he was sent away not to fight against French, and then he came back second time as in the engagement in Pittsburgh. So he broke his promise twice.
Based upon
just pointing it out. You know, we always praise George Washington for being so whatever. So just my point.
Any other questions? Okay. So here we are in 1764. So Parliament passes a series of acts. A lot of these you well know. We'll just go through them quickly to raise revenue to pay for the French and Indian War. 1764, Sugar Act. Tax on foreign molasses, sugar, indigo, coffee, wine, and regulated the export of lumber, which was a very important product in the colonies that was regulated. the export was regulated so they could only ship it to England. And a second act in 1764, the Currency Act, which said that colonies could not issue paper money as legal tender. So these two things already begin to bring to the surface deep-rooted feelings between the colonies and England. The next year, 1765, the infamous Stamp Act, which starts to begin the evolution some more of the colonial attitudes toward revolution, okay? This was a direct internal tax on American colonists. And Prime Minister George Grenville comes two things. Number one, it's money, it's generating revenue, but he also wants to establish sovereignty over the colonies. They want to show them that they still have the power. So this is a tax on stamps for any printed material and had to be paid in British sterling, not in colonial paper money. In the same year, they passed the First Quartering Act, which provided that Great Britain could house soldiers in American barracks and in public houses. It's a standing army, a peacetime army, not a fighting army. Okay, so the Stamp Act was an absolute disaster in that they couldn't find people to collect the tax when the ships came in and to pay for the tax on stamps. The stamp collectors were intimidated in many times and were just, they left, they couldn't do it, they were scared for their lives. A couple of homes were burned. So the Stamp Act never really did anything. And in the following year, in 1766, the British repealed it. So they just couldn't find anybody to collect the tax. So they repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but at the same time, they passed the Declaratory Act that said basically the Parliament had the right to legislate for the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. So that's an indication that they're trying to assert absolute authority over the colonies. Then the following year, 1767, the Townshend Acts, revenue duties on a number of things, tea, paper, glass, lead, and paint entering the colonies. A new Prime Minister, Charles Townshend, wanted to undermine the traditional English liberties and impose continental absolutism, okay? So at this point, the colonists are convinced now, many of them are, that there's a plot against liberty and property, a plot against liberty and property was developing. And John Adams was quoted as saying, there seems to be a direct and formal design that was needed for the French after the French were defeated. And there's a standing army in Boston, basically, but the French are defeated. There really is not a need for an army at all, but there's a standing army in Boston. Also, John Dickinson, who was from Pennsylvania, wrote Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. It was the most popular pamphlet of the 1760s. It rejected all parliamentary taxation throughout the colonies, and it was spread throughout, very popular, spread throughout the colonies, and that was in 1768. So we're still 7 years away. England's starting to sense of a problem here. Then later in 1768, sends troops to Boston, fighting troops to Boston, so to speak. So this is the first time that the British government has sent a large number of soldiers to enforce the British authority in the colonies. 2,000 soldiers in a city of 15,000. That was in 1768. That led to the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770. 5 people were killed, including, and I think this is the guy right here in the lower left, a guy by the name of Crispus Attucks, I guess, who was half black and half West Indian. They call him a mulatto. He was killed. John Adams, interesting that John Adams was hired by the British government to be the attorney. He was a practicing attorney in Boston. He was hired by an attorney to defend the British soldiers, and they were found not guilty of murder. So he did a great defense, and his feeling was that these are human beings. They need to have the right of defense like anybody else, and so he did that. So in a month after this, in 1770, the Townshend Acts are repealed, except for the duty on tea. The Townshend Acts had collected only 21,000 pounds revenue in 2 years, while the loss of British business, because the Americans would not buy the goods from England, they said, was 700,000 pounds. So the Townshend Acts did not work also, along with the Stamp Act. So that leads us to 1773, the Tea Act in May. It lowered the price of imported tea, lowered it by reducing the Townshend duties on it, but the colonists are forced to buy it from the East India Tea Company. And they didn't like that. So the colonists began boycotting tea and were turning ships back and refused the ships to unload the tea in the British harbor. And Thomas Hutchinson, who was the governor of Massachusetts, whose merchant family had the rights to sell the tea and whose house was destroyed during the Stamp Act crisis, refused the permission for the ships to leave. They had to unload the tea first, and then they could leave. And the colonists didn't want that. So that led to the Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773. So the colonists on the right, disguised as Mohawk warriors, they dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. So now we're getting to the point at a year and a half away or so of some real serious feelings and opposition to the British government, taxation without representation, all that stuff we've heard about. This is what this has been built up to. So the last straw in this whole series of acts comes in June of 1774 with the Intolerable Acts, which was Britain's reaction to the Boston Tea Party. So England says, we're going to close the port of Boston until you pay for the tea. The governing authority in Massachusetts was shifted from the elected assembly. The lower house was actually elected by the people of Massachusetts to be appointed by the governor. And governors in those days were appointed by England. The royal governors, this is the Second Quartering Act, could order quartering of troops with private families instead of using barracks. And obviously to the leaders of the revolution, this is a fixed plan now, they're feeling, is to enslave, this is the word they use, to enslave the colonies or bringing them under arbitrary government. So the intolerable or the coercive acts were the last straw. So now we're into a year before Lexington and Concord, May, less than a year, less than a year, May and June of 1774. So in reaction to that, led by Virginia and Massachusetts government or legislatures, they called for a general Congress of all the colonies to be scheduled in Philadelphia in September 1774, the following September. So which is called the First Continental Congress, and it meets from September 6th to October 26th, a matter of 6 or 7 weeks. And there's delegates from every state except Georgia. And they don't do a lot, but basically they approve a ban on imports from England to take effect in December. They approve non-consumption of the East India Tea Company immediately. They're still going to continue not to consume tea from the East India Company, and they prohibit exports to Britain the following year. And the final thing is they set a date, May 10th, 1775, for the start of the Second Continental Congress. So in the meantime, Virginia Governor Dunmore, along with the Massachusetts governor, those two dissolve the governments. They could do that based upon the Intolerable Acts. They could dissolve, I didn't mention that, but they could dissolve the legislatures if they wanted to. So in late 1774, early 1775, both Virginia and Massachusetts have their governments dissolved by the governors. So in Virginia, the members met on their own, and they're called Virginia conventions. So they meet in Richmond to ratify the resolutions of the First Continental Congress. And they're still not quite sure at this point how radical they want to be, how they want to take this. And we're at 6 months away. So a guy by the name of Patrick Henry gets up in the Virginia Convention. Here's the famous quote. And he says the British troops are going to, this is what he used, enslave the colonies. And so the quote is obviously, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And that was 2 months or so before the start of the revolution. So any questions now at this point as we get into the real nitty gritty stuff of this? Anything? See what my time is. Okay.
Good here. No, thank you. So good so far.
Okay. So we're at the eve of the revolution in spring of 1775. So what do the colonies look like? There's 2.5 million people. 20% of them, or 500,000, are men, women, and children who were enslaved. They were brought by force from Africa or the West Indies, beginning in 1619. Virginia had the most slaves by far. 200,000, or 40% of the slave population, was in Virginia. Every state had slaves. And it wasn't until March of 1780, 5 years from what we're talking, that Pennsylvania becomes the first state to to abolish slavery. And that rooted in the Quaker upbringing. And even Franklin, who admittedly he opposed slaves, had a few slaves. The only two individuals prominent of the revolutionary leaders who did not have slaves were John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, because of his upbringing in the West Indies, he was born in a little island called Nevis near St. Croix. He saw the horrors of the slave trade, and he just was a fierce abolitionist. Okay, vast majority of the slaves did not fight, and we'll get to that at the end. But the slaves who did fight were from the South, where the British offered them freedom if they would fight for the British, and at the end of the war, they could have their freedom. 500,000, the same percentage, or 20% of the people, were loyalists. And loyalists were a tiny minority in New England, but they were a considerable part of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the Deep South. And we've been talking about the most radical events all happened in Boston and Massachusetts. And that's because there was a strong sense of Puritanism in New England. And Puritanism is based a lot on positive written contracts. And New Englanders were used to thinking that way. They had contracts between members of the congregations and their ministers. They had contracts between people and God, covenants between people and God. And they were used to having agreements, written agreements. So when the British didn't do that, they felt that the British backed off on their agreements, they became very radicalized and very upset. And that's why you have the Tea Party, the Stamp Act, the burning of the people's home, of the governor's homes in Massachusetts, all that because of their Puritan background. Also, at this point, governors could dissolve legislatures, as I said a few minutes ago. They could veto legislation, they create courts, and they appoint all the judges. So they had a lot of power in 1775. Blacks, Indians, women, and men without property could not vote. And the last thing here is that most of the founding fathers really didn't have a strong sense of religion. And even though a lot of them attended church, Christianity was like a passive belief to them. So that's what the society looked like on the eve of the revolution. Okay, so back to Massachusetts in the spring of '75. Thomas Gage is the governor. He's also the general of the British Army. He wants to he dissolves the colonial assembly. So the assembly, which is colonial in power, moves to Concord, and all the supplies with it are stored in Concord. So the colonial leaders, since their government was dissolved, like Virginia, form a provisional government, call for local militias. They say to the local militias, let's train for hostilities. So in response to that, in February of '75, Massachusetts, they declare Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. So we're there. On April 14th of '75, Gage receives instructions from England to disarm the rebels and to imprison the rebel leaders, two of them, John Hancock, Sam Adams. So the British generals under Gage, Pitcairn and Francis Smith, receive orders on the afternoon of the 18th to go to Concord and to seize and destroy the military stores there. So late that evening, on the 18th, and here we go to one of the big parts of American history, William Dawes and Paul Revere, they're on the other side of the Charles River in Charlestown, one if by land, two if by sea. They see the lights. They found out that the British are going to go to Concord. Lexington was not part of the plan. And they're going to cross the Charles River in boats and then proceed towards Concord. And this is the Old North Church where the lights were hung on the evening of the 18th. So at 2 a.m. on the 19th, they leave Boston, the British do, they cross the Charles River, and on their way to Concord to capture the arms and supplies. En route, they're intercepted by a small group of Lexington militia in Lexington, which is about 6 to 7 miles east of Concord. So on the way to Concord, they come in to Lexington, and this is what the Lexington Green is behind this Minuteman statue. It's right here. And they have a 2-minute battle, a skirmish, so to speak. 8 militiamen are dead, 10 are wounded, and only 1 British soldier is slightly wounded. And that was it. There were 400 militia against, or I'm sorry, not 400, there were 80 militia against 700 British. So 2 minutes, and the British keep on going, and they go on to Concord. So at Concord, the first battle of the American Revolution is at a place called, as you see here, called the Old North Bridge, or the North Bridge. So Lexington was in the morning, Concord was in the early afternoon, and the British are on the Old North Bridge here marching, and the colonists are all around them, and they start firing, and they shoot and kill the British. So this was different. 75 British were killed, 175 wounded, 50 captured. The militia had only 50 killed and 39 wounded and 5 captured. So the British lost this. The first battle, shot heard around the world, of the American Revolution, and the colonists win it. So the British, whoever's left, pick up their wounded, whatever, and they march back to Boston, and they're back in Boston that evening of the 19th. Okay, so that ends the Lexington-Concord thing. The following month, a month from then, May 10th. Is there questions? If you have questions, just come right in. Right? May 10th, 3 weeks later, and this is interesting, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, you've all heard of, and Benedict Arnold capture Fort Ticonderoga from the British, who had captured it from the French in 1759. And they captured it from the British without firing a shot. Ethan Allen was passionate. He was from Vermont, and Vermont wasn't a state. It was a disputed territory between New Hampshire and New York, and he wanted Vermont to be a state, and the British hanging here was a problem. So he was asked by several Connecticut property owners and fairly well-to-do people to go up there and take the fort, have it controlled by the colonists as part of trying to get Vermont to become a state. So this is Fort Ticonderoga. This picture is looking east. That's Lake Champlain in the background. And the fort is at the location where Lake Champlain ends and Lake George begins. So they go in there without a shot in the early morning. They cross Lake Champlain in boats, go in, take the commander, and they take over Fort Ticonderoga without, as I said, firing a shot. So the fort was actually in terrible condition, and they really didn't do much when they had it to revive it. And they also, 8 miles up, going north up Lake Champlain was Crown Point, and they took that 2 days later. So on the same day, May 10th, the Second Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia. And on June 14th, a month later, decides to raise a Continental Army. Now remember, the British have retreated back to Boston, and they're basically located in downtown Boston, Boston proper, and the colonists are around it. But the colonists don't have a leader. They're a ragtag group of men, and they just happen to control the area around the city of Boston. So on June 15th, on June 14th, they decide to raise a Continental Army. John Adams nominates George Washington, and he's unanimously elected as Commander-in-Chief of Army of United Colonies, June 14th of 75. Now, 3 days after that, my slides are out of order, so I got to backtrack for a minute. 3 days after that, on June 17th, is the Battle of Bunker Hill. So at the bottom of the picture, that's where all the British are, where it says Copp's Hill. That's where the troops are. The colonists were told to occupy Bunker Hill, which is up here in the north, but for some reason, they go to Breed's Hill. They said that was closer to Boston. Then Bunker Hill was also easier. It was not as tall as Bunker Hill, so they could get the redoubts easier by not climbing as far. So in this battle, a one-day battle, it took the British 3 attacks to take the hill. The colonists were at the top. The British are attacking. They went to the right first time around and got pushed back. That's over here, number 1. Number 2, they do a second battle and lose. And then thirdly, with ships coming around and more troops, they finally, right here, take Breed's Hill, and the colonists lose. And the colonists could have stayed longer. They could have maybe eventually defended it, but they ran out of ammunition, and they had to retreat to Charlestown, which in the meantime was burning. The British had put it on fire. So they had to leave. They had to leave the hill, and the British take it over. Now, but what happened was the British suffered heavy losses, 1,000 killed or wounded out of 3,000. So 1/3 of the British troops were killed or wounded. 450 colonists were killed or wounded out of 2,400. So the colonists had less casualties, percentage of casualties, but they lost the hill and retreated back into where Bunker Hill is and around here and further west. So the British take Breed's Hill. And again, this is another one of, and we'll see a few more of these, the famous quotes of American history from General Israel Putnam from Connecticut. As the war starts, the quote is, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." So that is the Battle of Bunker Hill. And today, I gotta skip ahead. There is a big monument there. Oh, we got it twice. I guess I didn't order after all. Somehow we did it twice. And that's what it looks like today. You're up high in a hill in a very tall monument in a very nice area of Charlestown. So Washington is appointed commander on July 2nd, 1775. He arrives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a little bit west where Harvard is, 2 weeks after the battle, and he takes control of the Continental Army. And while he's there for a year and a half, and I guess David's not with us, but this is on the campus or right near the campus of Harvard. This is his headquarters on Bradlett Street in Cambridge, Mass. This is where he stayed from basically July of 75 until March of 76. Questions? So we're into the revolution. Okay? Now, so he takes control of the Continental Army, July of 1775. This is entitled The Siege of Boston. And basically, once the British retreated from Concord, they hang right in here. They're in the red. And the colonists are all in black or blue. As you can see, they're all around. To the south a little bit, obviously the west, and to the north and northwest. And the British have Breed's Hill. They control this area where the red arrow is. All right, they fortified the area west, a little bit of, can't get my arrow there, a Bunker Hill. You can see the red arrow, and the colonists are right to the left of that. So this siege lasted for almost a year. And we use the word siege because nothing happened. There was no fighting, there was no attacking, no defending, nothing. The British stayed there and watched the colonists. The colonists were around the British and they did nothing, all right? But two important things happened during that time. All right, one more comment before I get to that. I want to say this to you. 3 times during this time frame, Washington wanted to attack the British. He wanted to go in. And all 3 times, he was talked out of it by his advisors, his assistant generals, etc. And probably one of the best qualities of Washington was he would listen to his counsel and listen to advisors. So 3 times they said no, and he took their advice and did not do that, which was the right thing. So we're in a stalemate. So in November of 1775, Washington orders Henry Knox, General Henry Knox, one of his assistants, to go to Ticonderoga. Now it's controlled by the colonists, and get 50 cannons and bring them back to Boston. Well, that's a huge project. So and a lot of you know the country. You got to go west, like along the Massachusetts Turnpike, get to Albany, go north along the Hudson, Lake George, into Lake Champlain, take all the cannons out and bring them back. And that's what they did in the winter, November, December, January, February, 1775, 1776. They built these big sleds. So they go up there, they take the cannons out. It would have been 51 cannons if you included Henry Knox. He weighed almost as much as a cannon. And bring them back with no loss of life, no loss of the cannons that they took. They come down to Albany, they cross the Hudson River, up through the Berkshires. You got to go up and come down. And by February of 1776, the cannons are in this area here. So what Washington does at this point is he takes the cannons, and in the middle of the night, March 5th, 1776, with no one knowing, no British knowing, he moves the cannons and he puts hay around the wheels and builds fences, so to speak, to conceal the noise, and moves them from where it says Cambridge, where they are, all the way around here over to Dorchester Heights, south of Boston. So the British wake up in the morning of March 5th or 6th and they're looking up, and they see the British cannons. They had no clue what was going on. Great move. So at this point, Gage, who has now been replaced by Howe, decide this is not good. So they meet with Washington and they said, we'll leave the city of Boston alone, but let us get out of here. So by March 17th, 12 days later, on March 17th, all the ships and all the troops in Boston, along with a few loyalists, leave the Boston harbor and they go to Nova Scotia. So they leave Boston for good in March of 1776. So questions on that before we move along. Tell me how much longer you want me to. I have a lot of stuff. I can stop at any time. Whatever.
I'm good with your going on, Don. What do you guys feel like? You want to press your space bar and unmute yourself briefly and just weigh in on this a little bit?
Jacek here. As they said, either way, in a couple of minutes, I'll be taking off. Don, it's fun. It's a great presentation. And thank you for taking time to stop every now and then and ask if we want to add something. Thank you.
Thank
you. I'll be here just for a few more minutes. You guys continue as you choose.
Yeah, and I think Steve and I are the only two left. So we are recording it for the other guys. So go ahead, Don.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more.
All right. One bad thing that happened during the siege was that at the December 31st, 1775, Washington sends American troops under General Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold up to Quebec to try to take Quebec and that part of Canada from the British. A complete failure. Montgomery was killed. Arnold was wounded in the leg, and they failed to do that. So that was the only downfall to this whole time of the Siege of Boston. Okay, so the British are gone out of Boston. Washington leaves Boston the following month and goes to New York City, arrives there April the 13th. Now, New York City is quite different than Boston. 2/3 of the residents of the people who live in New York City are loyalists. Very few loyalists in New England, but a high percentage of loyalists in New York City. So Washington has to deal with that in terms of political situation and so forth. So certainly the demographics were different. So he leaves to go to New York, and he's thinking strongly that that's where Howe is going to go. So, but when he gets to New York City, all right, in April, they're not there. The British are nowhere to be found. So he establishes his residence and the troops in lower New York at the tip of Manhattan. And then on June 9th, all of a sudden, Howe shows up, leaves Halifax. He leaves Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he arrives at Sandy Hook in the lower New York Bay, basically where Staten Island and New Jersey are. Actually, he arrives there, he left Nova Scotia in June and arrived at Sandy Hook on July 2nd, 1776, which is the same day that 12 American colonies declared independence. The only colony that did not was New York, because New York would continue to abstain until the New York Convention approved the delegation of New York to approve the declaration, which was not until July 15th. But before that, on July 4th, obviously, the declaration was approved in its final form after Congress had made several revisions from the 2nd to the 4th. So the same day that William Howe arrives in New York, the Continental Congress declared independence. So we'll leave that sit for a minute. Declaration of Independence. So there were revisions between the 2nd and the 4th. 25% of what was there on July 2nd that Thomas Jefferson wrote was deleted. The major part being the part that was deleted was where Jefferson said that, quote, the Christian king of Great Britain was responsible for the horrors of the slave trade. That was removed, it was some other things, that was removed in its entirety because Jefferson said South Carolina and Georgia objected. But it would be absurd to think that as Americans and Christians, the king didn't bring the slave trade about, we did it ourselves, right? In fact, slavery was abolished, slavery was disdained by the British government. And the slave trade, Jefferson wanted to put the blame of the slavery and slave trade on George III, and that just wasn't the case. The British actually disapproved of the slavery system. So that and a few other things, that's what happened between the 2nd and the 4th. So on July 4th, whoop, I missed one thing here. Hold on a minute, sorry. Okay, let me backtrack, I missed something important. At the beginning of 1776, okay, 6 months before the Declaration, the American colonists were still at a stage where they were in the resistance mode and not in what do I want to say? They were not in the mode of favoring independence, but in the mode of favoring resistance. Still, there were a lot of merchants and politicians whose fortunes were tied to Britain. So there was economic cohesiveness there, and politically and philosophically, most of the Americans at the beginning of 1776 were not at a point where they wanted to fight Great Britain. Now, what changed that was the turning point here that shifted America's thinking from resistance to independence was the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, January 10th, 1776, which became arguably the most important political essay in American history at that time. And here's what he said, very briefly, okay? 59 pages, immediate bestseller, 120,000 copies sold in 3 months. So in proportion to the population, it's the largest sale and circulation of any book that was ever published in American history. So he says basically, society and government have different origins. Society is produced by our wants, government by our wickedness. Society promotes happiness positively by uniting our affections, the latter negatively by restraining our vices. First is a patron, the last is a punisher. So he says society in every state is a blessing. The government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. And he called George III the royal brute of England. So when that came out and that was distributed, that really changed the mentality of the colonists. So he also, one last thing, he said, a line of distinction should be drawn between English soldiers taken in battle and inhabitants of Americans taken in arms. So you have the English prisoners, you have the British prisoners. The English are prisoners. The Americans are traitors. The former lose their liberty. The former forfeits their liberty. The Americans will lose their heads. And that's what he's saying here. So that really shifted the mentality here. Okay, I missed that. I'm sorry. So we go to July 4th, 1776, Independence Hall, Pennsylvania. We have the Declaration. Basically a restatement of contract theory of John Locke. Parliament and King George III repeatedly violated the contract and drove the Americans to become independent, only after everything else had failed. And the king was the focus of the rejection. Now, the part of the Declaration that people remember the most, all men are created equal, written by Thomas Jefferson. He said that, and this is his, and we can talk about this at some other time if you want. So Jefferson says this: blacks were the equals of whites because they possessed a moral sense that gave them their humanity. So they are human beings, whites are human beings, and we are created equal. But he said he never believed that they could ever enjoy equality in a society that mixed them with the whites. He said a history of oppression and white prejudice made an interracial society unthinkable. He said slavery had so poisoned the affection of both blacks and whites to make their living together as equals impossible. Okay, now that's what he's saying here. And as you as well know, okay, aside from Jefferson himself, over the course of his lifetime had 600 slaves. And aside from the children he had with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, Jefferson never freed any of his other enslaved people at Monticello, despite believing that slavery was morally wrong. And when he died in 1826, he had around 200 people as slaves, and he was $100,000 in debt, which is like $2.5 million today. Jefferson was, his wife died, never remarried. He was a widower most of his life, and he lived lavishly. When he was in France, negotiating the Treaty of Paris, he spent lavishly in France. So my sense is, in terms of who we really are, and this is just one person, and there are others, of who we really dig into, of what our feelings are, I have a difficult time with him having read this. So getting back to the Declaration, in reference to slavery was one of, so he talks about all men created equal, endowed with their creator with certain inalienable rights, which are life, liberty, in the pursuit of happiness. Most of the Declaration after that is a list of grievances against the King of England, what he has done to incite rebellion and independence. And one sentence in there to read to you that Jefferson said was referring to the king: he has excited domestic insurrections among us. That's reference to the Virginia governor giving freedom to slaves if they fought for the British at the end of the war. If they fought for the British, they would get their freedom at the end of the war. That's what it refers to. And has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So, finally then, on the 4th, they sign the Declaration. They don't sign, excuse me. The Declaration of Independence is presented to John Hancock, who is seated right here, by the committee of 5 who developed it. John, going left to right, John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. Presented on the 4th, then copies had to be made and so forth. They didn't actually, just for your own information, nothing was not actually signed, as you know, with all the signatures, the John Hancock in big letters, on August the 2nd, about 4 weeks later. So, the last thing to say, maybe at the Declaration, we can stop, be a good stopping point. Declaration reaches New York City on July 8th, and Washington reads it to his troops on July 9th, the next day. So even if we still have the British still over in Sandy Hook, they haven't done anything at this point, They've been there a month and they're just hanging in there and not really doing anything. So we still have no fighting, and the American troops are in the lower part of New York and together, and Washington reads this to them on July 9th. So I think at this point, before we get into the actual battles of the American Revolution after the independence, I'd like to stop, if that's okay, with any questions. It's almost 9:15.
That sounds great, Don. Do we have any questions you want recorded, or should I stop the recording now?
I think you can stop it, Jerry.
Okay.